Record high interest rate hikes are not working to slow the pace of inflation in Africa's largest economy. Nigeria's National Bureau of Statistics said that annual inflation rose to 22.22% in April from 22.04% the previous month as the price of food continued to rise. Now, this is the highest inflation figure recorded for Nigeria in the past 17 years. Inflation has remained elevated in the country, eroding savings and incomes and prompting the central bank to hike interest rates to their highest level in nearly 2 decades. Food inflation, which accounts for the bulk of Nigeria's inflation basket, rose to 24.61% in April from 24.45% in March. The Central Bank of Nigeria is due to set interest rates next week after hiking the benchmark lending rate in March by 50 basis points to 18%, citing continued price pressures and a weakening naira currency. Gospel Obele, chief economist for Streetnomics, joins me now as we look at how these rates, whether inflation or interest, are, of course, affecting the Nigerian consumer. Gospel, welcome again to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Tolulope. Morning.
So let's go straight into it. We see that Nigeria's inflation rate remains very stubbornly high, resisting the interest rate hikes, which are supposed to be the economic tool or the policy tool used to abate that rise. So in terms of why this format is not working, let's start from there. What's wrong with the format? Or is it that it's a different tool or a different policy we need to put in play?
Yeah, I mean, there's technically nothing wrong with the format. The problem here is that the construct of inflation we're dealing with right now is not monetary. That format was designed as a monetary response to a monetary informed inflation crisis or monetary induced inflation crisis. So, and the world has moved. You know, in 2019, nobody ever believed that a global health pandemic would lead to a global lockdown as a result of a global recession. You know, the top of mind argument would be a global economic challenge, you know, would lead to a global economic recession. So that's the era we're in. This inflation is non-monetary. It's not driven by high money supply, as against the early guess of a couple of stakeholders, you know, and as a result, you know, the constant rise in interest rates. However, this inflation is driven more around structural dynamics of geopolitics, climate change, geopolitical tensions across regions as well, and of course the uncertainties around the cost of living crisis the world is faced with right now, especially as it borders heavily on supply chain, etc. Now, if you juxtapose that vis-a-vis the construct of the Nigerian economy being import-led with the FX crisis and all of that, you realize that the fabric of this inflation is much more way beyond just monetary. So trying to use interest rates as a standalone tool to deal with a multifaceted inflationary crisis is necessary but not sufficient. Yeah, so the effort so far has been necessary to dealing with the inflation challenge we're faced with because it's here again still under the monetary purview of the central bank, but it's not sufficient. So sufficiency will mean that a cluster of tool mix sort of, you know, has to be brought into the mainstay in terms of thinking of solutions on how, you know, we can drive down inflationary numbers. And the era we're living right now, we're now dealing with inflation on one end. At the other hand, we're dealing with a rising cost of living or a deepening cost of living crisis, meaning that inflation has so permeated into the day-to-day living of the average Nigerian that it's sort of building new levels of poverty trap because the average Nigerian is faced with the pressure of, you know, getting by on the day-to-day basics in terms of basic necessities like food, transportation, and other likes, which are the pressure points through which the cost of living crisis or inflationary impact, you know, hits heavily on the average Nigerian. So that is creating new cycles of poverty trap because disposable incomes are shrinking. People do not have much amount of money, you know, to spend to have a daily life and the likes. And that's a new wave of challenge we'll get to deal with in the future. But I mean, just to answer the question is the fact that this inflationary nature is very different and it sits within the context of beyond interest rates as a solution pathway to finding something more sustainable around how do we bring down the numbers and also the cost of living impact.
Monetary situation, it's not a monetary crisis. What then do we call it? Because I think people work with descriptors and names. If it's not a monetary situation in which we can't see the typical format working because it's not a monetary issue, what type of issue would you describe this as then?
I mean, I think the word is yet to suffice. I mean, these are just the impact of globalization and some form of you know, interconnectivity amongst markets and how it's impacting our local market based on where we're positioned. So again, lots of intentional acts have to go into what fiscal efforts need to come on the table, and how do we blend that with monetary efforts such as the interest rates to relax the cost of living crisis or inflationary pressure in Nigeria. These are the major issues. Let's not forget also around October, November last year, there were a couple of flood issues in strategic production, food production, supply side states in Nigeria. And now we're also looking at how that may have had some ripple effect around it. So on one end, we're sort of reaping the fruits of that fiscal indiscipline over the years. However, it's not impossible. The challenge will be how, or rather the solutions will question around what fiscal support instruments, in line with interest rates can be used to douse down the inflation rate or the cost of living crisis. Anything short of that, leaving into the monetary guys, will not necessarily yield any strategic or significant results.
Okay, so let's do a quick comparison in terms of how Nigeria's inflation rate is comparing to other African countries or even global averages right now, because as you mentioned, this seems to be more of an impact or an effect of globalization and how interconnected our supply chains and our economies have truly become. Yeah. So when we look at it, where do we stand in regards to things? This is the largest economy, most populous nation, most populous black nation on earth, largest economy on the African continent, and inflation rates that continues to rise despite interest rate hikes that we're seeing across the world, except for maybe a few exceptions. So how does Nigeria compare in this time and circumstance?
I mean, the first off is the fact that we are on the receiving end of the value chain. In terms of how vulnerably designed and positioned our economy has been. However, the inflation narrative, the cost of living crisis, and the fact that interest rates haven't been able to do justice to rising inflation is a global issue, not a Nigerian issue only. So we've seen the UK inflation hit as high as 10.1% in recent times. And there are big questions around, are we on the verge of recession breakout or something like that? But however, the global economies to a large extent have much more relief programs, new charity relief initiatives that are really permitted into the community level. A lot of support are going into, how do we relax the pressure and all of that. However, the dynamics is a bit different in Nigerian space because of how relatively disorganized our economy is structured and how non-responsive we are to these issues. So, to a very large extent, the crisis is really going to deepen further down the line. Also being the fact that this is a period of almost no policy response from the fiscal sector as a result of the transition about to happen. But we really do hope that the necessary support initiatives, relief packages, and structural solutions will be tailored to sorting this problem once and for all. And also to say that I think that the Nigerian inflationary numbers are still understated. They are way worse than what it is right now, especially when you take into consideration the fact that the Nigerian inflation basket has not been reviewed in almost 5 to 10 years. So if the real inflation out there is much more higher than what we have in terms of numbers, as a result, bordering heavily, significantly on the cost of living challenge we're faced with right now as a nation. So it borders heavily around what relief solutions, what initiatives, what structural reforms can we put in place in the mid to long term to ensure that we bring these numbers down significantly. It's been on the rise for the past 5 years, even before the Russia-Ukraine war started. Since COVID-19 has been on the rise. So it just tells you how non-responsive and reactive our economy has been structured to be, and it's not sustainable in any way going forward.
All right, so two things you said that struck me and will lead me to the next question. One, that we should expect this crisis to deepen, but that also you expect these numbers are being understated. So let's look at the impact of the continued increase on the country's inflation rate. So as you said, food inflation, this is accounting for the bulk of Nigeria's inflation basket, but we also know that Nigerians spend more than half of their income on food. So Gospel, for the average Nigerian, what do you think the impact has been of the high inflation rates? Very stubbornly high, very persistently high. What's the impact we're feeling in our pockets and around us generally?
Yeah, so I slightly spoke of this earlier on. It's that vicious cycle of poverty trap, and that trap is deepening as the day goes by. If 50% of disposable incomes are spent on food, and food is at the heart, #1 cost pressure penetration point for inflation right now in Nigeria, even globally, you realize that it means that people will be spending more portions of their disposable income just to feed, and that's a bit tricky because you also have energy right there. You also have the fact that the quality or the value of the currency is failing vis-a-vis the food-led inflationary crisis. So technically, the average individual cannot necessarily do way beyond the disposable income in terms of trying to get a life, aspire to live your dreams, seeking to stay afloat and all the likes. The construct will be around striving to get down the day-to-day, which is in itself some form of poverty trap because income levels are shrinking. So even if incomes are rising for certain consumers, realize that the disposable block is shrinking, and it automatically also wiped out discretionary income spending as well. All right, so it means that some sectors by default will naturally suffer from the fact that disposable incomes are shrinking in itself. So it's building a new wave of poverty trap, which is not a conversation we're even ready to start right now. Which is reasons why I say that we are gradually diverging in terms of the argument on inflation and the argument on cost of living crisis, and that's because it's taking a new shape entirely in terms of impacting people's day-to-day, in terms of hijacking dreams and aspirations, in terms of affordability patterns, purchase behavior, and the likes. And it's going to impact heavily on consumer spending as we go into the coming months. Major brands are now withdrawing. Major companies, multinationals are now withdrawing major brands that have long existed in the Nigerian market. They're now withdrawing, taking those brands off the market as a result of worsening consumer spending patterns and all that. And it's quite bleak for the FMCG sector as well, because consumer choices are getting tougher by the day. Consumer purchasing power is shrinking. And going forward, actually, for businesses who want to think of staying profitable in the FMCG space, it's no longer an argument of following the consumer money. It's not an argument of following the consumer purchasing power and the blocks where those purchasing power are stronger the most.
All right, so let's look at the other side of that, or one of the other angles of this, and that's also the impact of the increase in interest rate hikes as well. So it hasn't been doing what the CBN wants it to do. We've all agreed on that, but it has had some kind of impact. So, Gospel, in terms of the impact of the interest rate hikes, what have they been on the Nigerian economy?
I mean, the impact of interest rate hikes, if you want to look at it on the positive end, it's just a reward for the financial sector. Lenders are being on a party spree since this rise went up. It technically means that people will earn more. Stakeholders who are in the business of facilitating and providing credit, all right, are in good business right now, because technically would mean that the value of money and the volume of monies that will come back to them as payback, repayment, debt servicing, as the case may be, has almost doubled or tripled in the last 1 year. And that's relatively a plus for that credit market, high-end credit market. However, we've also seen that plus has also come with some form of a slide of failure of growth in the real sector, significant failure of growth in the real sector. We've seen manufacturing, trade, and other related real sector engagements, slide in recent times, and that's a big deal, because technically means that the cost of borrowing, the cost of capital, the cost of working capital, the cost of doing business has risen. Even if some critical stakeholders have been benefiting from that increased cost per se. So yes, there's a plus, but there's also a corresponding minus, if not directly proportionate. And my worry is that there is increasingly a divergence on how the financial sector is currently playing out in terms of successes and all that, and the real sector. And it looks as though the interest rates are being used as an instrument to favor the financial sector over the real sector, both knowingly and unknowingly. And this is not just a case of Nigeria, it's happening globally. Yeah. Financial markets are getting stronger at the expense of the real sector. And that's really a fast link to both a worsening cost of living crisis and a recession.
All right. So before I let you go, two very quick questions that will be focusing on the central bank now. It's obvious that whatever tools the central bank is trying to use are not achieving its aims. What options are left for the bank?
The only options left to the bank is to collaborate more with the fiscal authority and begin to look for low-hanging fruits at that level of collaboration that can deliver relief across stakeholders. It has to be relief first. Once you've achieved relief, the level that we now need to begin to deal with the structural reform issues and things we need to introduce, to sort of begin to fix structural dynamics. The reason why we need to fix the structural dynamics, we can say, yeah, it may take time. The reason why that's key is because at the end of the day, we are faced with a challenge because of our positioning and because of how we've been faring as a nation, all right? So that alignment with fiscal authority is really critical, because right now the central bank has limited options to deal, owing to the fact that this inflation is not monetary in nature. And the central bank has also run out of options, all right, trying to also do the work of the fiscal authority. You see the central bank lending into the agricultural sector and running anchor borrower programs. Those are areas where it's primarily not In as much as the central bank needs to shift focus and balance out of things, it doesn't necessarily mean they need to be to play active, as headline stakeholders in those areas. So how do we partner with the fiscal authorities to deliver new, nuanced instruments to relax the cost of living crisis and the inflationary pressure we are faced with? That's going to be the big ticket question for the president-elect, and how he seeks to work with the apex monetary institution, again, and how they carry along stakeholders both in the financial and non-financial sector and fiscal sector to ensure that both subnationally and regionally, inflationary numbers are coming down. Anything below or less than this, the central bank is having its MPC meeting next week, which is likely going to be the same act or that we've seen over time. Anything less than all of these things will lead to possibly a self-destruct state, and I think Nigerians are already living in recession. We just haven't had the boldness to come out to declare that this is a recession, or maybe because we're ready for 2 quarters of negative growth. But the dynamics have changed.
All right, and you've mentioned the MPC meeting, so we know that the CBN hiked the benchmark lending rates in March by 50 basis points to 18%, also citing continued price pressures and a weakening naira currency, which also falls right on the desk of the CBN as well. In terms of next week, it seems you expect them to continue with this very hawkish stance, and we see another interest rate hike. What are you thinking about in terms of the numbers?
I mean, at the very worst case scenario, it's going to be a hold. At the very worst case scenario, it's going to be a hold. At the very worst case scenario, it's going to be a rise. At the very best case scenario, it's going to be a hold. It cannot be a drop. It can't be a drop because that interest rate rising spree is a collaborative effort by central banks globally. And you don't want to be on the wrong side of those books, quote unquote. But then again, it's quite unfortunate because we are losing the touch of context here, and how that can really cripple the economy. And seeing the fact that there's not been any significant impact on inflation numbers. However, I do not also think that the stakeholders who are at the helm of making these decisions are willing to see things differently. As much as the data is there and all the dynamics are right on the table, that it's not a monetary-driven inflation. However, because central bank needs to make a decision as an apex monetary institution, that decision has to be monetarily driven, which in this case, to hold interest rates or to slightly increase interest rates. I don't think there's going to be a drop in that interest rate.
Do you want to hazard a guess as to if there's a decision to increase, what the numbers will look like?
I'm not expecting for it to hit a 19%, maybe an 18.5. I don't expect to go too high. Also because of the uncertainties around the transitioning of government, in the coming week or weeks. So I don't expect it to hit so high, but I'll be surprised if it hits so high because that will be literally jumping the gun 2-3 times down the line in the context of all the uncertainties we're in. And again, that's the worry for me. All right, central bank needs to really relax a lot of policy moves this period, because the economy needs to settle. There's a lot of dust in the air that needs to settle. And we need to really find our clearly charted path towards a sustainable, pathway around the challenges we are faced with. So this is not the time to begin to jump from one pillar to one post with significant 3% or, 200 basis points rise. I don't think that would be fair, in context to the real sector development and the cost of living crisis we are faced with. All
right. Gospel Obele, Chief Economist for Streetnomics. Always a pleasure having you on Business Edge. Thank you as always.
Thank you for having me as well. Wishing you a great day.
All right. And the conversation here in Africa's largest economy is one where the pockets have gotten leaner, the costs in the markets have gotten tighter, and Nigerians are asking, as my guest has said, where the relief will come. But Nigeria's Monetary Policy Committee will be meeting with, of course, of the CBN coming weeks, about a week or two. And of course, the decision will be before them. Will they hold or will they increase? It seems very likely that there will not be a decrease in these increasing interest rates that have been meant to bring down the inflation rate. But Nigeria has not witnessed a decrease in its inflation rate in several cycles. We'll keep our eye on this development, of course, as it involves many different factors. And of course, with a handing over a new administration coming in, where these issues are going to land right on the desk of the President-elect Tinubu's administration. You're watching Business Edge. We have international business headlines coming up for you. When we come back, we're also in Southern Africa, where Zimbabwe is getting some more attention and help from the African Development Bank along the lines of its debt resolution situation. So we'll bring you up to speed with that.